billionaire single dad watches a waitress play with his disabled son. Just a kind moment, or so he thinks. But as he keeps coming back, something unexpected happens. His son begins to smile again. And so does he. What starts as a simple diner visit soon turns into a bond that neither of them saw coming. But when he tries to change her life with one powerful gesture, everything falls apart. Why does she walk away? And what secret is she hiding that could change all three of their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm, pushing away the heavy drops that pelted the glass. Ethan Cole's knuckles were white against the dark leather of the steering wheel as he navigated through the gloomy evening traffic. The day's physical therapy session had been particularly challenging for Jamie, and the silence in the car felt as thick as the rain clouds overhead. Through the rearview mirror, Ethan caught glimpses of his 7-year-old son in the specially modified back seat. Jamie's small fingers traced the worn edges of his favorite pirate book, his eyes fixed on the raindrops racing down his window. The book's spine was cracked, its pages soft from countless readings, but Jamie clutched it like a lifeline. "How about some takeout tonight?" Ethan's voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. These car rides had become a familiar dance of awkward attempts at conversation and long stretches of silence. Jamie just shrugged, his fingers still working at the book's corner. The gesture made something in Ethan's chest tighten. There had been a time when his son's eyes would light up at the mere mention of pizza or Chinese food, when his laugh would fill every corner of their too-big house. The rain drummed harder on the roof as they passed through downtown. Through the gray curtain of water, a small diner caught Ethan's eye. Warm yellow light spilled from its windows onto the wet sidewalk, and without really thinking it through, he flicked on his turn signal. "Let's try something different tonight," he said, carefully maneuvering into a parking spot. He wasn't sure what made him stop. Maybe it was the way the diner looked like a lighthouse in the dreary evening, or maybe he just couldn't face another silent meal at their formal dining table. Getting Jamie's wheelchair from the car was a practiced routine now, though the rain made everything slicker, more difficult. Ethan's expensive suit was damp by the time he helped Jamie settle into the chair, but for once, he didn't mind the discomfort. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the diner. Warm air wrapped around them, carrying the smell of coffee and grilled food. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars at the counter and an elderly couple in a corner booth. The red vinyl seats and chrome fixtures gave the place a timeless feel, like stepping into a pocket of the world where things were simpler. As Ethan helped Jamie maneuver to a booth, the pirate book slipped from his son's lap and skidded under the table. Before either of them could react, a young waitress appeared, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a name tag that read, Nora. Instead of just picking up the book, she dropped into a theatrical crouch, her eyes wide with excitement. "Captain," she stage whispered, loud enough for Jamie to hear clearly. "You dropped your map. Quick, before the rival pirates spot our secret location." The sound that came from Jamie was so unexpected that Ethan nearly dropped the menu he'd just picked up. His son was laughing, actually laughing, a sound that had become as rare as summer snow since the accident. Jamie's eyes crinkled at the corners, just like they used to. Nora handed the book back with a conspiratorial wink. "I've heard tell there's buried treasure in these parts," she continued, pulling out her order pad with a flourish. "Perhaps some golden chicken nuggets or the legendary buried burger?" Jamie sat up straighter in his wheelchair, his earlier melancholy forgotten. "Do you know about pirates?" he asked, his voice carrying an enthusiasm Ethan hadn't heard in months. "Know about them?" "Why, I've sailed the 7 seas myself." Nora balanced her pen behind her ear like a proper swashbuckler. "Though these days, I prefer to guard the treasure of perfectly cooked fries and chocolate milkshakes." As she took their order, Nora kept the game going, referring to Jamie as Captain. and treating his menu choices as important decisions that would affect the whole crew. Not once did her eyes linger sympathetically on his wheelchair or flicker with that familiar pity Ethan had grown to hate. She spoke to Jamie directly, meeting his eyes, matching his growing excitement with her own playful energy. Ethan found himself watching their interaction, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time someone had treated Jamie so normally. No careful tiptoeing, no overly gentle voices, no sad smiles. Just simple, genuine connection. When their food arrived, Nora had arranged Jamie's chicken nuggets in the shape of a ship, with French fry masts and a ketchup sea. "Land ho," she announced, setting the plate down with a flourish that made Jamie giggle again. Throughout the meal, she stopped by their table between serving other customers, always ready with a new pirate joke or a question about Jamie's book. Each time, Jamie grew more animated, more present, more like the little boy he'd been before everything changed. Ethan ate his burger in relative silence, but his attention never strayed far from his son's transformation. He found himself studying Nora when she wasn't looking. The genuine warmth of her smile, the graceful way she moved between tables, the gentle confidence with which she drew Jamie out of his shell. When it came time to pay, Ethan pulled out his wallet and left a tip that probably exceeded the cost of their meal. But words failed him. How do you thank someone for giving you a glimpse of your child's lost joy? He simply nodded at Nora, gathering their things as Jamie waved goodbye to his new friend. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle as they made their way back to the car. Once Jamie was settled in his seat, his book back in his lap, Ethan started the engine. The silence felt different now, lighter somehow. "I liked the pirate girl," Jamie said softly from the back seat, his voice carrying a contentment Ethan hadn't heard in far too long. Ethan nodded, catching Jamie's reflection in the rearview mirror. His son was still smiling, holding his book close to his chest, and for the first time in months, the expression reached his eyes. Something shifted in Ethan's chest, a crack in the careful walls he'd built around his heart since the accident. The following Thursday arrived with surprising swiftness. Ethan sat in his home office, absently scrolling through emails while his mind wandered to the evening ahead. The last few days had been different. Jamie had been different. The boy had taken to carrying his pirate book everywhere, even to school, like a treasured companion. "Jamie?" Ethan called out, checking his watch. "Time to think about dinner, buddy." He found his son in the living room, sprawled on the carpet with his art supplies scattered around him. Jamie had insisted on moving from his wheelchair to lie on his stomach, propped up on his elbows as he worked intently on what appeared to be a drawing of a spaceship. "What are you thinking for dinner?" Ethan asked, crouching down beside him. The question was routine, though Jamie's answers were usually just shrugs or quiet, "whatever you want," responses. Jamie's crayon paused mid-stroke. He looked up at his father, then back down at his drawing, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "Can we?" He started, then stopped, fidgeting with the crayon. "What is it?" Ethan encouraged, trying to keep his voice gentle, neutral. "Can we go back to the pirate place?" The question was barely above a whisper, but it made something warm bloom in Ethan's chest. He hadn't expected Jamie to ask, hadn't realized his son had been thinking about the diner too. "The diner?" Ethan clarified, though he knew exactly what Jamie meant. When Jamie nodded, still looking at his drawing, Ethan found himself smiling. "Sure, we can do that." This time, the drive felt different. There was purpose in their direction, anticipation in the air. Jamie sat straighter in his seat, his pirate book in his lap as always, but his eyes were fixed ahead rather than lost in the passing scenery. The diner's neon sign glowed softly in the early evening light. Unlike last week's impulsive stop, Ethan deliberately pulled into the same parking spot, noting how Jamie's fingers tightened expectantly around his book. Inside, the diner was busier than their last visit, but not crowded. The same warm smell of coffee and grilled food wrapped around them as they entered. Ethan had barely finished helping Jamie settle at a booth when a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't Captain Jamie." Nora appeared beside their table, her smile bright and genuine. She was wearing the same blue uniform, but today her dark hair was braided over one shoulder, and she had a pen tucked behind her ear. Jamie's face lit up at being remembered, and Ethan found himself stepping back slightly, giving them space. He slid into the booth across from Jamie, content to observe. "I've got something for you, Captain," Nora said, producing a paper napkin with flourish. She'd drawn what looked like an elaborate treasure map on it, complete with dotted lines and tiny illustrations. X marks the spot where the sweetest treasure in all the 7 seas is buried. Jamie leaned forward eagerly, examining the map with serious concentration. "What kind of treasure?" "Well," Nora lowered her voice conspiratorially, "legend speaks of a double chocolate cookie hidden by the fearsome Baker's Brigade, but only the bravest pirates dare to seek it." Jamie's laugh rang out, clear and bright, filling the diner with its unexpected joy. Several customers turned to smile at the sound, and Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm brave enough," Jamie declared, sitting up straighter in his wheelchair. "I thought you might be," Nora winked, producing a cookie wrapped in wax paper from her apron pocket. She set it beside the map with ceremony. "You've earned this treasure, Captain." As Jamie carefully unwrapped his prize, Nora took their drink orders. Ethan requested coffee, watching as she jotted it down with the same pen that had drawn the treasure map. "And for the captain?" "Chocolate milk," Jamie said, then added more quietly, "Please." While they waited for their drinks, Jamie showed Nora his pirate book, pointing out his favorite illustrations. Then, almost shyly, he mentioned his other passion. "I like space stuff too. Did you know that Saturn's rings are made of ice?" "Space?" Nora's eyes lit up with interest. "Now that's something I need to learn more about. Tell you what, next time you come in, I'll have some space trivia ready. Maybe we can trade facts, pirates for planets." Actually, Ethan found himself speaking up. "Saturn's rings are made of ice, rock, and dust particles, some as tiny as a grain of sand, others as large as buildings." Nora raised an eyebrow, a playful challenge in her expression. "Oh, really? And here I thought I was talking to the space expert." She gestured at Jamie, who was grinning at their exchange. "Sounds like we've got 2 knowledgeable customers here. I'll have to double-check my facts before next time." The word "next time" hung in the air, full of possibility. Jamie beamed at the suggestion, and Ethan found himself oddly pleased by it too. The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, with Nora stopping by between serving other customers to chat with Jamie about everything from constellations to comic books. Ethan mostly listened, sipping his coffee, surprised by how comfortable the atmosphere felt. When it was time to leave, Jamie clutched his treasure map napkin carefully along with his book. At the door, he turned to his father, hope written clearly across his face. "Dad, could we come every Thursday?" Ethan hesitated, years of careful scheduling and controlled routine warring with the simple joy he'd witnessed in his son tonight. "We'll see," he said, but in his heart, he already knew the answer. The way Jamie's face had lit up, the sound of his genuine laughter. These were things worth rearranging schedules for. As he helped Jamie into the car, Ethan glanced back through the diner's window. Nora was at their table, efficiently clearing away their dishes, but something made her look up. Their eyes met through the glass, and she smiled, a simple, warm gesture that seemed to linger in the evening air. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to Ethan's usual rushed weekends. He sat at his kitchen island, laptop open, scrolling through his to-do list. Dry cleaning, grocery shopping, email catch-up. The familiar rhythm of errands that typically filled his Saturdays stretched before him. A soft thump from the living room caught his attention. He found Jamie wheeling himself back and forth in front of the large windows, stopping occasionally to stare outside, then resuming his restless movement. The morning sun caught his son's dark hair, highlighting the slight furrow in his brow, a look Ethan recognized as Jamie's thinking too hard expression. "Everything okay, buddy?" Ethan asked, leaning against the door frame. Jamie's wheelchair came to a stop. He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, not meeting his father's eyes. "Just thinking." Ethan moved into the room, settling onto the couch near Jamie's chair. "About what?" "Nothing," Jamie said quickly, then amended. "Everything." He went back to wheeling in small circles, each rotation bringing him slightly closer to where Ethan sat. Watching his son's restless movement, Ethan felt a familiar pang. Saturdays were hard for Jamie. No school to structure the day, no therapy appointments to focus on, just empty hours that sometimes seemed to stretch endlessly. "Would you like to go somewhere today?" Ethan offered, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. Jamie's wheelchair stopped abruptly. He looked up at his father, hope flickering across his face. "Really? Where?" "Anywhere you'd like," Ethan said, though he had a feeling he knew what was coming. Jamie's fingers drummed against his armrest, a nervous habit he'd developed recently. "Could we?" He started, then paused, gathering courage. "Could we go see Nora?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan had expected it, but hearing it still surprised him. They'd only been to the diner twice, yet somehow Nora had made such an impression that his usually shy son was actively asking to see her. "The diner?" Ethan clarified, keeping his voice neutral. "It's not Thursday." "I know," Jamie said quietly, looking down at his hands. "But maybe she'd still be there." Ethan studied his son's hopeful expression, thinking about his list of errands, about the emails waiting for responses, about the careful structure he'd built around their lives. Then he thought about Jamie's laugh echoing through the diner, about the way his son's eyes lit up when solving Nora's riddles. "Let's find out," he said simply. The drive to the diner felt different in the morning light. The parking lot was busier than their evening visits, weekend breakfast crowds filling the spaces. Jamie clutched his spacebook, a new addition to his collection, as Ethan helped him from the car. Inside, the diner hummed with Saturday energy. The clatter of plates and murmur of conversations created a warm backdrop of sound. For a moment, Ethan worried they wouldn't find Nora among the busy staff hurrying between tables. But then her voice rang out clear and bright. "Captain Jamie!" And on a Saturday, too. Nora appeared between tables, her hair pulled back in a messy bun today, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wore the same blue uniform, but there was something different about her weekend presence, a bit more relaxed, despite the busy atmosphere. "I've got something special for you today," she said, leading them to an empty booth. She produced a folded paper from her apron pocket. A space riddle, and she pulled out what looked like a handmade sticker, decorated with stars and planets. "Your very own astronaut badge. Every space explorer needs proper credentials, right?" Jamie's face lit up as he carefully accepted both items. The sticker was clearly made with marker and paper, sealed with clear tape, simple but thoughtful. He held it like it was made of gold. As the morning rush began to thin, Nora found more moments to stop by their table. During a particularly quiet spell, she slid into the booth next to Jamie, pulling out her phone. "Want to try some constellation puzzles?" she asked, showing him an app on her screen. "You have to connect the stars to make the pictures." Jamie leaned in eagerly, his finger carefully tracing patterns on the screen while Nora offered gentle hints. Ethan watched them, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest at the sight of his son so engaged, so present. His phone buzzed, breaking the moment. His assistant's name flashed on the screen. Ethan stepped away from the table to answer. "Mr. Cole, I wanted to confirm you're still declining the emergency board meeting this afternoon. Mr. Davidson was quite insistent about your presence. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. Yes, I'm still declining. The quarterly reports can wait until Monday. He returned to find Jamie still absorbed in the constellation game, Nora pointing out patterns he'd missed. But something in her expression had shifted, more reserved, more aware. She must have overheard his call. More coffee? She offered, standing up smoothly. When Ethan nodded, she returned with the pot, studying him as she poured. You know, you always look like you're waiting for bad news. The observation caught him off guard. He looked up at her, finding no judgment in her expression, just gentle amusement and something that might have been concern. Maybe I am, he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. Nora's smile softened, warming her eyes. Then we'll have to keep giving you good news instead. The simple statement hung between them, unexpectedly powerful in its sincerity. Before Ethan could respond, she was called away to another table, leaving him to contemplate her words over his coffee. When it was time to leave, Jamie carefully tucked his new astronaut badge into his book for safekeeping. As Ethan helped him into his jacket, Jamie looked up with shining eyes. Dad? I want to learn the names of every star. Ethan glanced down at his son's earnest face, remembering nights of reading pirate stories, watching Jamie's imagination come alive. Then we'll need books, he said simply, already making a mental note. Through the diner's window, he could see Nora disappearing into the back kitchen. She pulled out her phone, her expression changing as she read whatever message appeared on the screen. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys, responding to a text that read, "Hospital again tomorrow." The Monday morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the downtown bookstore, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Ethan stood in the astronomy section, his fingers trailing along the spines of countless books. A store employee had already stacked several recommendations on a nearby table, everything from beginner guides to advanced star charts. Jamie wheeled himself slowly along the aisle, eyes wide as he took in the colorful covers. "Dad, look at this one," he called out, pointing to a large format book with stunning nebula photographs. "It looks like rainbow clouds." Ethan pulled the book down, adding it to their growing collection. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Jamie this excited about learning something new. The spark had been there ever since Nora's constellation puzzles. "We should get this one too," Jamie said, reaching for another book. Nora said the best way to learn constellations is to start with the stories behind them. Of course she had. Ethan smiled slightly, adding the mythology-focused astronomy guide to their pile. By the time they checked out, they had enough books to fill Jamie's entire backpack. The next few days fell into a new pattern. Tuesday evening found them back at the diner, Jamie eagerly showing Nora his favorite pictures from the books. Thursday afternoon, he brought his school astronomy worksheet, which Nora helped him complete between serving other customers. By Saturday, Jamie had memorized the names of 3 major constellations and couldn't wait to share his knowledge. But something was different about Nora today. The usual brightness in her smile seemed dimmed, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She still greeted them warmly, still had a space fact ready for Jamie, but her movements were slower, more careful, as if she were conserving energy. "And then in class," Jamie was saying, spreading out his latest reading assignment, "we're having this contest. Whoever reads the most challenging books gets a special prize." "That's fantastic," Nora said, her genuine enthusiasm breaking through her apparent exhaustion. She pulled out her order pad but didn't write anything yet. "You know, if you want to really impress them, you should try some of the bigger astronomy books. They count as science reading, and they're usually rated for older kids." Jamie's eyes lit up. "Really? Like the one about black holes?" "Exactly," Nora nodded. "Plus, you already know so much about space now, it'll be easier than you think. Sometimes the best way to tackle harder books is to read about something you love." Ethan watched the exchange quietly, struck by how naturally Nora understood exactly what would motivate his son. She didn't just suggest easier books or try to protect him from a challenge. Instead, she found ways to make the challenge itself more appealing. When Jamie became absorbed in one of his new books, Ethan caught Nora's eye as she passed their table. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, keeping his voice low enough that Jamie wouldn't hear. "You seem tired today." Something flickered across her face, surprise at his notice perhaps, or hesitation about how to respond. "I'm fine," she said, managing a small smile. "Long night. My sister's been sick again." She turned away quickly to refill another customer's coffee, clearly not wanting to elaborate. The brief exchange stayed with Ethan through dinner. He noticed how Nora took more frequent breaks than usual, how she leaned against the counter when she thought no one was watching. There was a weight to her movements that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. Later that evening, after they'd returned home and Jamie was engrossed in his astronomy books in the living room, Ethan retreated to his home office. He sat at his desk, fingers hovering over his phone for a moment before making the call. "Sarah," he said when his assistant answered, "I need you to look into something for me, discreetly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "One of the waitresses at Miller's Diner, Nora Hale. I need to know if she needs any help." "Of course, Mr. Cole. I'll have the information for you first thing tomorrow." Ethan ended the call, feeling slightly guilty about the request. It wasn't suspicion driving his curiosity, quite the opposite. He'd seen enough people hiding struggles behind brave faces to recognize the signs. The next morning, Sarah's email arrived while he was making Jamie's breakfast. He waited until Jamie was occupied with his morning routine before opening it on his tablet. The details painted a clear picture. Nora had been a promising college student studying child psychology until her sister's condition worsened 3 years ago. She'd dropped out to become Becca's primary caregiver, taking on 2 jobs, the diner during the day and remote data entry work at night. Their family insurance had lapsed after their parents' death, leaving them struggling with mounting medical bills from Becca's treatments for a progressive autoimmune disease. Ethan set down his tablet, thinking about all the times Nora had gone out of her way to make Jamie smile. How she'd created games and puzzles, drawn maps and made badges, all while carrying such heavy burdens of her own. She'd never once hinted at her struggles, or treated their interactions as anything but genuine moments of connection. That evening, he stood in Jamie's doorway, watching his son sleep peacefully. One of the astronomy books Nora had recommended lay open across his lap, the pages marked with sticky notes in Jamie's careful handwriting. His son's face looked relaxed, content in a way Ethan hadn't seen in too long. Walking back to his office, Ethan's decision was already made. He opened his laptop and composed a brief email to his legal advisor. Find a way to cover her sister's medical debt, quietly. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It wasn't charity. It was reciprocity for something far more valuable than money. Hope in his son's eyes, laughter in their home again, and the simple gift of being treated like any other family finding their way forward. The Thursday afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patches across the worn linoleum floor. The lunch rush had dwindled to just a few regulars nursing their coffee, and the familiar ding of the bell announced Ethan and Jamie's arrival. Nora's tired features softened into a genuine smile as she watched them settle into their usual booth. Jamie's wheelchair fit perfectly in the space they'd cleared months ago, and he was already pulling out his latest drawing supplies. Ethan helped him arrange the colored pencils just so, a small ritual they'd developed over their many visits. "The usual for our favorite astronaut?" Nora asked, approaching their table with her order pad, though she hardly needed it anymore. The dark circles under her eyes were more pronounced today, and she leaned slightly against the booth as she wrote. "Yes, please," Jamie beamed, "with extra stars." "Galactic pancakes, coming right up." Nora winked at him before turning to Ethan. "Coffee black, like your soul." Ethan's lips twitched in what might have been almost a smile. Someone has to balance out all the sugar in those pancakes. Nora moved to the kitchen, her movements slower than usual. She carefully arranged Jamie's pancakes, adding whipped cream stars and blue food coloring swirls to create their signature galaxy effect. It took a few extra minutes, but she never skimped on the details that made Jamie's face light up. When she returned to their table, Jamie was putting the finishing touches on a drawing. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration as he added one final crayon stroke. "This is for you," he announced proudly, holding up the paper. Nora set down their plates and took the offered drawing. It showed 3 stick figures standing together. One tall with spiky black hair that could only be Ethan, one in a wheelchair with a big smile that was clearly Jamie, and between them, a figure with long brown hair wearing what looked like a cape. "That's you," Jamie explained, pointing to the caped figure. "You're part of the crew now. See? We're all together." Something caught in Nora's throat as she studied the simple drawing. The 3 figures were holding hands, and Jamie had drawn stars all around them. She felt tears threatening to well up, but quickly blinked them away, maintaining her bright smile. "This is beautiful, Captain Jamie," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "I know exactly where I'm going to hang this, right above my locker in the back." Ethan watched the exchange silently, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Nora's reaction. She could feel his gaze but avoided meeting it, focusing instead on making sure Jamie's pancakes were cut into perfect bite-sized pieces. Later that evening, after her shift ended, Nora sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Becca's hospital bed, absently flipping through a magazine she wasn't really reading. Her sister dozed fitfully, the medication making her drift in and out of consciousness. The sharp ring of her phone startled them both. Nora quickly answered it, stepping into the hallway to avoid disturbing Becca. "Ms. Hale?" a professional voice asked. "This is Sandra from the hospital billing department." Nora's stomach clenched. These calls never brought good news. "Yes? I'm calling to inform you that your sister's outstanding medical debt has been settled in full." The words didn't make sense at first. Nora pressed her back against the cool hospital wall. "I'm sorry, what?" "The entire balance, all past due amounts and current charges, has been paid through a private foundation. I don't have details about the source, but it's all been verified and processed." Nora's mind raced. That's impossible. It was tens of thousands of dollars. "Nevertheless, the account shows a zero balance now. You should receive formal documentation in the mail within a few days." After ending the call, Nora stood in the hallway for several long minutes, trying to process what had happened. She went back into Becca's room, gently touching her sister's arm. "Beck, did anyone reach out to you about financial assistance? Any social workers or organizations?" Becca's eyes fluttered open briefly. No, just the usual people." She shifted slightly, already drifting back to sleep. "Why?" "Nothing. Never mind. Get some rest." The next morning, Nora arrived at work early, her mind still churning with questions. She mechanically went through her opening routine, starting coffee, checking supplies, wiping down tables. When the bell chimed at exactly 4:15 p.m., she knew without looking who it would be. Ethan held the door for Jamie's wheelchair, helping him navigate the slight bump of the threshold. They settled into their usual spot by the window, Jamie already chattering about the space documentary they'd watched the night before. Nora watched them from behind the counter, noting how Ethan's shoulders seemed less tense these days, how his responses to Jamie were becoming more engaged, less guarded. She was reaching for the coffee pot when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. The message was from an unknown number. "Hello, Ms. Hale. This is Claire Matthews, your new assigned social worker at Memorial Hospital. I'm following up to confirm that all financial obligations have been processed through the foundation. Please let me know if you have any questions." Nora's hand tightened around the coffee pot handle, as the pieces clicked into place. She looked over at Ethan, who was now reading softly to Jamie from one of their astronomy books. The afternoon sun caught his profile, and for a moment, she saw him clearly. Not just the reserved, wealthy father who brought his son to a small diner, but someone who had the power to make tens of thousands of dollars disappear with a single email. Her smile faded as emotions warred within her. Gratitude, confusion, and something that felt uncomfortably like anger. The coffee pot grew warm in her grip as she stood frozen, watching father and son while her mind raced with implications. She knew exactly who had paid Becca's debt, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. The evening sky painted streaks of purple and orange across the horizon as the last customers filtered out of the diner. Nora mechanically went through her closing routine, wiping tables, counting the register, restocking napkins, all while avoiding Ethan's gaze. Jamie had fallen asleep in his wheelchair, peaceful and unaware of the tension crackling through the air. Ethan stood by their usual booth, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the checkered floor. He watched Nora work, noting how her movements were sharp and precise, lacking their usual easy grace. When she finally grabbed her purse from behind the counter, he cleared his throat. "Let me walk you to your car," he said quietly, careful not to wake Jamie. "It's getting dark." Nora paused, her hand tight around her purse strap. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. Then she gave a slight nod, her face unreadable in the dim light. They stepped out into the parking lot together, the evening air heavy with unsaid words. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel, echoing in the empty lot. The fading daylight cast everything in soft shadows, making the moment feel somehow both intimate and exposed. When they reached her old Honda Civic, Nora didn't unlock it. Instead, she turned to face Ethan, her shoulders squared despite her smaller frame. In the dying light, her eyes were dark and determined. "You paid for her, didn't you?" The words came out flat, more statement than question. There was no need to specify who her was. They both knew. Ethan didn't hesitate. His voice was steady when he answered, "Yes." "Why?" The single word carried the weight of so many other questions. "Because I could," he said simply. He took a step closer, his expression earnest. "Because I saw what it was doing to you, and you were still showing up for Jamie, still making him laugh, still creating magic for him when you were exhausted and worried sick about your sister." Nora's jaw tightened. Ethan continued, his words coming faster now. "I didn't do it out of guilt. I did it out of respect for everything you've given us, given Jamie." "Respect?" Nora's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Respect doesn't come with a price tag, Mr. Cole." The formal address stung like a slap. "You don't get to buy people's burdens and then pretend you're the good guy." "That's not what this was about," Ethan protested, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I wasn't trying to control you or make you feel indebted. I just wanted to help." "Help?" Nora's voice cracked slightly. "You went behind my back. You looked into my private life. You made decisions about my family without even talking to me. That's not help. That's control." "Nora, please." Ethan stepped forward again, but she backed away. "I never meant—" "Stop." She held up a hand. "Just stop. You know what the worst part is? I trusted you. I trusted that what we had here, what we were building, was real. But it was just another transaction for you, wasn't it? Another problem you could throw money at." "That's not fair." Ethan's voice grew tight. "You know that's not true." "Do I?" Nora's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you decided my sister's medical debt was just another business deal. Something you could fix with your checkbook and your foundations and your quiet little arrangements." She took a shaky breath, squaring her shoulders. "I quit. Both jobs, the tutoring and the diner. I'll give my notice tomorrow." "Nora." Don't do this." Ethan's voice held a note of desperation she'd never heard before. "Think about Jamie." It was the wrong thing to say. Nora's expression hardened. "Don't you dare use Jamie to manipulate me. He deserves better than that. And so do I." She yanked open her car door. "Don't contact me. Don't try to fix this. Just leave me alone." "Please," Ethan started, but she was already sliding into the driver's seat. "Goodbye, Mr. Cole," she said, and the formal tone felt like a wall slamming down between them. The car door shut with a definitive thud. Ethan stood in the parking lot, watching her taillights disappear into the gathering darkness. The weight of what he'd lost, what he'd broken, settled heavy on his shoulders. When he returned to his car, Jamie was awake, blinking sleepily in the back seat. His small hands clutched the pirate drawing Nora had given him on their first visit, a simple sketch of a treasure map with a big X marked Jamie's spot. "Where's Nora?" Jamie asked, his voice small and confused. Ethan's throat closed up. He couldn't find the words to explain, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his son's eyes. He started the car in silence, the engine's hum filling the space where an answer should have been. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Jamie looked down at his drawing. His next words hit Ethan like physical blows. "You broke her, didn't you?" The drive home was silent. Later, in his vast empty house, Ethan paced his study until the early hours of the morning. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nora's face in the parking lot. Hurt, angry, betrayed. He saw Jamie's drawing on the refrigerator, 3 stick figures holding hands under a sky full of stars. He saw all the ways he'd tried to help and ended up causing harm instead. The night stretched endless before him, filled with the echoes of Nora's words and the weight of Jamie's quiet accusation. "You broke her, didn't you?" For once in his life, all his money, all his power, all his careful control couldn't fix what he'd broken. 2 weeks dragged by like years in the Cole household. The familiar rhythm of their lives had fractured, leaving behind a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Jamie's wheelchair sat unused in front of his beloved telescope, gathering dust. His space books remained stacked and untouched on his bedside table, the colorful cosmic illustrations no longer holding their previous magic. Ethan watched helplessly as his son retreated further into himself. Jamie's therapist called with concerns. He wasn't participating in his exercises anymore, barely responding to questions. The bright, curious boy who had finally started emerging was disappearing again, like a star fading from view. One morning, Ethan's assistant called about an urgent board meeting. "Cancel it," he said, watching Jamie push his breakfast around his plate without taking a bite. He'd been canceling a lot lately. Meetings, conferences, business trips. His office collected dust while he tried desperately to bridge the growing gap between him and his son. But nothing worked. His attempts at conversation were met with silence or single-word responses. When he suggested alternative restaurants for dinner, Jamie just shook his head. The diner's absence loomed large between them, an unspoken wound neither knew how to heal. One evening, after another silent dinner at home, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He wheeled Jamie into the living room and knelt beside his chair, forcing himself to meet his son's distant gaze. "Jamie," he said softly, "please tell me what's wrong. I want to help, but I don't know how." For a long moment, Jamie just stared at his hands folded in his lap. Then his lower lip started trembling. "Why does everyone leave?" The words came out in a broken whisper, and something in Ethan's chest cracked open. Jamie's shoulders began to shake. "Mom left. And now Nora's gone too. And you?" He hiccuped through a sob. "You're here, but you're not really here. Not since Mom." The truth of it hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on providing for Jamie materially, the best doctors, the best equipment, the best care, that he'd missed what his son really needed: presence. Real emotional presence. Not just a father who occupied the same space, but one who was truly there. He reached for Jamie's hand, and for once, didn't try to fix anything. He just held on while his son cried, letting his own tears fall freely for the first time in years. Later that night, after Jamie had finally fallen asleep, Ethan sat in his study feeling hollowed out. His eyes landed on Jamie's drawing journal, lying open on his desk where he'd left it earlier. He'd been flipping through it, searching for any sign of what his son was feeling. He turned another page and froze. There, rendered in careful crayon strokes, was a drawing he hadn't seen before. Nora stood in what looked like a library, surrounded by floating books and stars. She wore a crown made of constellations, and her smile was exactly as he remembered it, warm and real. Jamie had captured something essential about her, even in his childish style. At the bottom of the page, in wobbly letters, he'd written, "The Star Queen in her castle." Ethan stared at the drawing for a long time. A library. Of course, Nora had mentioned once in passing that she'd studied library science before dropping out of college. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. The next morning, Ethan made calls. He had his assistant check local library branches, starting with the ones closest to the diner. By afternoon, they had a match. A small suburban branch where a Nora Hale had recently started working. Ethan drove there immediately, parking across the street. Through the large windows, he could see her moving between the shelves, her arms full of books. She looked different in this setting, more subdued, but still with that same gentle grace that had first caught his attention. He didn't go in. This wasn't about him. The next day, he helped Jamie get dressed without saying where they were going. His son remained quiet during the drive, staring out the window as suburban streets rolled by. When they pulled into the library parking lot, Jamie's head snapped up in recognition of the building type, but he said nothing. Ethan wheeled him through the front doors, past rows of colorful children's books. They turned a corner, and there she was, Nora, reaching up to slide a book into place on a high shelf. Her back was to them, but even from behind, Jamie recognized her immediately. His whole body tensed in the wheelchair. "You forgot me," he whispered, his voice small and hurt. Nora froze at the sound. She turned slowly, a book still clutched to her chest like a shield. When she saw Jamie, her eyes immediately filled with tears. She dropped to her knees beside his wheelchair, the book forgotten on the floor. "Oh, Jamie," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "I never could, not ever." The library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Nora held Jamie's hand, both of them trying to steady their breathing through tears. Ethan stood back, giving them space, his heart aching at the sight of his son's fingers curled tightly around Nora's, as if afraid she might disappear again. "I miss our space adventures," Jamie whispered, his voice wobbling. Nora wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I miss them too, Captain." Jamie looked up at her hopefully. Could you maybe come help me study sometimes? I'm falling behind in school." Nora's eyes flickered to Ethan, who remained carefully neutral, letting her make the choice. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "I could tutor you," she said slowly, emphasizing the professional nature of the arrangement. "Twice a week if your father agrees, just for schoolwork." "Please, Dad." Jamie's eyes shone with more life than Ethan had seen in weeks. "Of course," Ethan said softly. "Whatever works best with your schedule, Nora." They arranged the details there in the library, Tuesdays and Thursdays after Nora's shift. Her tone remained polite but distant as she wrote down her availability, careful not to let her hand brush Ethan's when she handed him the paper. The following Tuesday, Nora arrived exactly on time, carrying a canvas bag full of learning materials. She'd dressed professionally, a simple blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. The message was clear. This was work, nothing more. But the moment Jamie saw her, professionalism melted away. He wheeled himself to the door faster than he had moved in weeks, nearly running over Ethan's foot in his excitement. "Nora, look what I got!" He thrust a new astronomy book toward her. "Dad got it yesterday. It has all the constellations we talked about." The sound of Jamie's laughter echoing through the house again made Ethan's chest tight. He watched from the kitchen as Nora set up their study space in the living room, spreading out books and worksheets with practiced ease. She had a natural teacher's instinct, knowing exactly how to keep Jamie engaged while challenging him. "I heard about the regional spelling bee," she said, pulling out a stack of blank index cards. "Want to start preparing?" Jamie's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "I still talk to Mrs. Peterson at the library. She mentioned you signed up." Nora smiled, already writing words on the cards. "Think you're ready to be a spelling champion?" "I don't know," Jamie admitted, suddenly shy. "Some of the words are really hard. Then we'll start with the easier ones and work our way up. That's how all champions begin." She held up the first card. "Ready?" For the next hour, Ethan moved quietly around the house, pretending to work, but really just listening to the gentle back and forth between Nora and Jamie. She had a way of turning everything into a game, making even the most challenging words feel conquerable. When Jamie spelled necessary correctly, his whoop of triumph brought Ethan to the living room doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching as Nora high-fived his son. "Did you hear that, Dad?" "I got it right." "I heard," Ethan smiled. "You're working hard." Nora glanced up, catching his eye for just a moment before looking away. But in that brief contact, something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared joy in Jamie's success. The tutoring sessions fell into a rhythm. Twice a week, Nora would arrive with new materials and ideas. Jamie thrived under her attention, tackling increasingly difficult words with determination. His confidence grew steadily, along with his vocabulary. Ethan kept his distance, but he couldn't help watching from doorways and around corners. He noticed everything, how Nora's professional facade softened a little more each visit, how her laugh became more frequent, how she sometimes caught herself looking for him when Jamie made progress. She noticed his watching too. He could tell by the way her shoulders would tense slightly when she sensed his presence, then gradually relax as he made no move to interrupt or interfere. One evening, after a particularly successful study session, Jamie fell asleep early, worn out from all the mental exercise. Ethan found Nora gathering her things in the living room, the last rays of sunset painting the walls gold. "Would you like some tea before you go?" The words surprised them both. Nora hesitated, then nodded. Tea would be nice. He prepared it in silence, chamomile he remembered from the diner, and led her out to the back patio. The evening air was cool and sweet with jasmine from the garden. They sat in comfortable chairs, steam rising from their cups, neither speaking for several long minutes. Finally, Nora broke the silence. "Why are you scared to talk to me like before?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan stared into his tea, gathering courage. When he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. "Because I think I love you," he said simply, "and I don't know if I can survive losing someone again." The words seemed to echo in the gathering darkness. Nora sat very still, her tea untouched in her hands. After what felt like an eternity, she set the cup down carefully and stood up. "Thank you for the tea," she said softly. "Good night, Ethan." She gathered her things quietly, not meeting his eyes. At the front door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle a moment longer than necessary. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan remained on the patio, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He lifted his cup with slightly shaking hands, finishing his tea alone as stars began to appear in the darkening sky above. The Sunday morning rain tapped against the kitchen windows in a gentle rhythm, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the Cole household. Jamie sat at the large oak table, hunched over what appeared to be several pieces of paper, his wheelchair positioned just right to give him the perfect angle for whatever secret project consumed his attention. Ethan wandered past, coffee mug in hand, trying not to hover. His son's determined expression reminded him so much of Sarah, his late wife, when she used to grade papers at that same table. The memory didn't sting as sharply as it used to. His thoughts drifted to Nora, as they often did these days. She'd been coming by more frequently now, not just for Jamie's tutoring sessions, but sometimes just to drop off new books or share interesting space facts she'd discovered. Yet there remained an invisible barrier between them, like a glass wall neither dared to break. Jamie's pencil scratched steadily against the paper. When Ethan walked by again, his son quickly covered his work with his arms, shooting his father a look that clearly said, "No peeking." Ethan raised his hands in surrender and backed away, a small smile playing at his lips. The rain continued throughout the day, creating a peaceful backdrop to their quiet Sunday routine. Jamie remained dedicated to his mysterious project, only taking breaks for lunch and bathroom visits. Ethan busied himself with work emails, though his mind kept wandering to Tuesday's upcoming spelling bee and how proud Nora looked during Jamie's practice sessions. By late afternoon, Nora arrived for their usual pre-competition review. She carried her familiar canvas bag, now decorated with space-themed pins Jamie had given her. The session went well, with Jamie nailing even the trickiest words. But something felt different today. Nora seemed more relaxed, less guarded. She even laughed at one of Ethan's terrible attempts at a science pun. After she left, Jamie wheeled himself to his room, calling out, "Dad, can you come here for a minute?" Ethan found his son sitting by his desk, holding what looked like a handmade book. The cover was carefully constructed from construction paper, bound together with colorful yarn. Jamie's normally confident expression held a touch of nervousness as he held it out. "I made this," Jamie said softly. "Well, Nora helped me with some of the drawings and the binding, but I wrote it myself." Ethan took the booklet gently. On the cover, in Jamie's careful printing, was the title, "The Man Who Forgot How to Feel." "Can you read it alone first?" Jamie asked, his voice small but determined. "In your room?" Ethan nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He carried the precious cargo to his bedroom, settled into his reading chair, and opened to the first page. The story began with simple words but carried profound weight. Once there was a man who kept his heart in a box. He didn't mean to put it there, but after something very sad happened, he thought it would be safer locked away. Each page featured Jamie's distinctive artwork, enhanced by Nora's gentle guidance. The man's face drawn with careful lines, the box around his heart decorated with tiny locks. The story continued, describing how the man's little boy tried everything to help his father remember how to feel again. The boy told jokes, but the man only smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. The boy showed him pictures of happy things, but the man only nodded and went back to work. The boy even tried to make the man's favorite cookies, but they came out wrong, and still the man's heart stayed locked away. Ethan's vision blurred as he turned the pages. The story went on to describe a brave girl who came into their lives. She didn't try to break the box open. She just showed them both that it was okay to feel scared sometimes, or sad, or happy, or anything at all. The illustration showed the girl, unmistakably Nora, doing simple things like reading stories, making silly faces, and holding hands with the boy while the man watched from a distance. Gradually, in the pictures, the box around the man's heart began to crack. The brave girl had to go away for a while, the story continued, and the box around the man's heart got tighter than ever. But the boy never gave up hope, because he knew something the man didn't know yet. Ethan turned to the final page, where Jamie had drawn a simple but powerful image, the man, the boy and the girl together, surrounded by stars and hearts. Below it, the last line read, "But then he remembered, because she came back." Tears fell freely down Ethan's cheeks now. He closed the book carefully, holding it against his chest for a long moment. Then he stood up, wiping his eyes, and walked to Jamie's room. His son lay fast asleep in bed, one arm wrapped around the small stuffed astronaut Nora had given him after his first successful practice spelling bee. The nightlight cast star-shaped patterns on the ceiling, creating a peaceful glow throughout the room. Ethan knelt beside the bed, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He pressed a gentle kiss to Jamie's forehead, careful not to wake him. "You're right," he whispered. "It's time." Standing up, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Nora. "Tomorrow, after the spelling bee, I need to talk to you." Really talk. The morning of the spelling bee dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to Jamie's nervous energy as he sat in his wheelchair, fingers drumming against the armrests. Ethan knelt before him, carefully buttoning the crisp blue shirt they'd picked out together the week before. "Hold still, buddy," Ethan said softly, adjusting the collar. "Almost done." Jamie's fingers wouldn't stop moving. "What time is it?" "Nora said she'd be here at 8 to practice." "It's almost 8, right?" Ethan glanced at his watch, trying to keep his expression neutral. 8:15. "She'll be here soon," he assured Jamie, though a small knot of worry had begun to form in his stomach. Nora was never late, especially not for Jamie. "What if I forget everything?" Jamie whispered, his confidence from yesterday's practice sessions suddenly evaporating. "What if I mess up the first word?" "Hey," Ethan caught his son's restless hands, holding them gently. "Remember what Nora taught you about breaking down the tough words? You've got this. You've worked so hard." Jamie nodded, but his eyes kept darting to the front door. 8:30 came and went. No Nora. Across town, Nora was rushing around her small apartment gathering her things. Her lucky pencil for Jamie, the new space-themed tie she'd bought him as a surprise. Her note cards with encouragement phrases written in glitter pen. She was already running late, having stayed up most of the night helping Becca through a pain flare. "I'm heading out," she called to her sister's room. "Text me if you need anything." Her hand was on the doorknob when her phone rang. The hospital's number flashed on the screen. "Ms. Hale?" A calm but urgent voice spoke. "Your sister Becca has been brought in by ambulance. She collapsed about 20 minutes ago." The world tilted sideways. Nora's bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the floor. The glitter pen cards scattered like fallen stars. I was just with her," Nora stammered. "She was okay. She was just tired." "The ambulance is already en route. You should come right away." Nora's hands shook as she gathered her things, tears blurring her vision. Jamie's face flashed in her mind, his excited smile yesterday when they practiced, his absolute trust that she would be there. But Becca needed her more. At the school auditorium, Jamie's wheelchair was positioned near the front of the stage, along with the other contestants. His eyes kept searching the crowd, hope dying a little more each time the door opened, and it wasn't Nora. Ethan sat in the front row, his heart aching as he watched his son's growing distress. He'd tried calling Nora 3 times, straight to voicemail. This wasn't like her at all. Something must be wrong. The principal stepped up to the microphone, welcoming everyone to the regional spelling bee. Jamie's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Our first contestant," the principal announced, "Jamie Cole." Jamie wheeled forward slowly, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. The microphone was adjusted to his height. He glanced once more at the empty seat beside his father, the one that should have held Nora. "Your word is pharmaceutical," the judge stated clearly. Jamie's voice came out barely above a whisper. Can you use it in a sentence?" Ethan leaned forward, willing his son to look at him. When Jamie finally did, Ethan mouthed the words Nora always said before practice. "You've got this. She believes in you." Jamie took a deep breath. "Pharmaceutical. PHARM ... He paused, uncertainty creeping into his voice. A ... From the doorway at the back of the auditorium, a familiar voice whispered just loud enough to carry CEUTICAL. Jamie's head snapped up. There, leaning against the doorframe, looking exhausted but present, was Nora. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair messily pulled back, but her eyes were fixed on Jamie with fierce pride. CEUTICAL. Jamie finished strongly, his whole face lighting up. "Correct," the judge announced. The competition continued, with Jamie spelling word after word correctly, drawing strength from Nora's presence. She didn't take a seat but remained by the door, as if ready to run at any moment. Still, she never took her eyes off Jamie, giving him a small thumbs up after each successful word. In the final round, Jamie faced off against a tall 8th grader for first place. After 3 intense rounds, Jamie missed chrysanthemum by 1 letter, securing 2nd place. But from his beaming expression, you'd think he'd won Olympic gold. The moment the ceremony ended, Jamie wheeled straight through the dispersing crowd, making a beeline for Nora. She dropped to her knees just in time to catch him as he launched himself from his chair into her arms. "You came," he whispered into her shoulder, holding on tight. "Of course I came." Nora's voice broke slightly. "I promised, didn't I?" Ethan approached slowly, taking in Nora's pale face and the slight tremor in her hands as she hugged Jamie. Something was definitely wrong, but she'd come anyway. For Jamie. For them. "I had to come," she said, looking up at Ethan with tears in her eyes. "I told him I would." Ethan gazed down at her, at this woman who had changed their lives so completely, who kept showing up even when it cost her everything. His heart felt too big for his chest as he replied softly, "And I told myself if you did, I wouldn't waste the second chance." A week had passed since the spelling bee, and the Cole house felt different. Warmer somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the newfound happiness within them. The fireplace crackled softly in the living room, casting dancing shadows across the hardwood floors and illuminating the cozy scene before it. Jamie sat cross-legged on his favorite cushion, a new astronomy book spread across his lap. His wheelchair stood empty nearby, forgotten in his excitement to share the latest space facts he'd discovered. Nora lounged beside him on the plush carpet, her head propped up on one elbow, hanging on his every word with genuine interest. Across from them, Ethan sank deeper into his leather armchair, coffee cup warming his hands. He watched them both, marveling at how natural this felt, how right. The past week had been a whirlwind of hospital visits and worry, but Becca was stable now, responding well to her new treatment plan. The shadow of fear that had haunted Nora's eyes was finally lifting, replaced by something brighter, more peaceful. "Did you know," Jamie announced, pointing to a glossy page, "that Saturn's rings are made of billions of pieces of ice and rock? Some pieces are as tiny as sand, and some are as big as houses." "No way!" Nora gasped with theatrical amazement, making Jamie giggle. "Houses floating in space? That's incredible." "Dad, can we get a telescope?" Jamie looked up at Ethan hopefully. "A real one, not just the little one from the Science Museum?" Ethan smiled, remembering a similar conversation with his own father years ago. "I think that could be arranged. Maybe we could set it up on the back deck." "Yes!" Jamie bounced excitedly, then turned to Nora. "You'll help us look for constellations, right? You know all the best stories about them." "Absolutely," Nora replied, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Though your dad might know more about the actual science part than I do." "That's okay," Jamie said seriously. "Dad knows the facts, but you make them fun." Laughter filled the room, Real, unguarded laughter that seemed to chase away the last lingering shadows of their past struggles. Ethan couldn't remember the last time his house had felt so alive, so full of joy. He caught Nora's eye across the room, and something electric passed between them. Later that evening, after Jamie had reluctantly agreed to go to bed, but only after extracting promises about telescope shopping the next day, Ethan found Nora standing by the French doors that led to the back patio. She was watching the snow fall, soft flakes drifting lazily in the porch light. "Would you like to step outside for a minute?" he asked quietly. Nora nodded, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself as they stepped out into the crisp night air. Their breath formed small clouds in the darkness, and snowflakes caught in Nora's hair like tiny stars. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow transform the garden into something magical and new. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, but for once, he didn't try to quiet it. "I've loved you quietly for months," he finally said, his voice soft but steady. "I just didn't know if I was allowed to feel it again, or if I deserved to." Nora turned to face him, snowflakes melting on her cheeks. Her eyes were bright with understanding, and something more, something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. "You do," she said, taking a step closer. "But only if you stop hiding behind what you lost." She reached up, her hand gentle against his cheek, "and start holding on to what's right in front of you." The space between them disappeared slowly, inevitably, like tide meeting shore. When their lips finally met, it was soft, a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Ethan's arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her closer as snowflakes swirled around them in the quiet night. When they finally pulled apart, Nora's smile was bright enough to rival the stars they'd been reading about earlier. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers, breathing in the moment, memorizing every detail. They made their way back inside, hands linked, to find Jamie sitting at his desk in his room. He was hunched over a paper, writing with intense concentration, his tongue sticking out slightly at the corner of his mouth. Ethan and Nora stood in the doorway, watching as Jamie carefully wrote the final line in his new story. His handwriting was precise, each letter formed with deliberate care. And then, they all remembered how to be a family again. With satisfaction, Jamie closed the notebook and stood up, walking over to his bookshelf. He placed the new story next to its predecessor, the one about the man who forgot how to feel. The two books sat together, a before and after, a journey completed. Jamie turned around, spotting them in the doorway. His face lit up at the sight of Ethan's arm around Nora's waist, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he asked, "Can we go see the stars tomorrow?" Ethan looked down at Nora, then back at his son, his heart full to bursting. "We can do anything now." If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Nora, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.